Imagine this. You are 14 years old, lying half asleep on the cold stones of Rome's filthy streets. Hunger gnaws at your stomach like a beast you cannot kill. Your skin is pale, your bones visible beneath your rags. You are a forgotten child of a city drowning in plague, war, and poverty. No one cares if you live or die. Then suddenly, a shadow. Fine silk shoes stop inches from your face. You look up. A man towers over you. Rings glitter on his fingers, enough wealth to feed you for a year. He bends down and offers you bread. Warm, fresh bread, the smell intoxicating. For a starving child, it feels like salvation. But salvation has a price you don't yet understand. The man's name is Cardinal Giovanni del Monte. Soon the world will call him Pope Julius III. But in this moment he is something far more dangerous than a priest. He is a hunter. And you are his prey. You don't know that he has been watching you for weeks, studying where you sleep, which scraps you fight for, how desperate your eyes look when you beg. You don't know that your loneliness makes you valuable. That your beauty, sharpened by hunger, makes you irresistible. You only know that bread means survival. And so you take it. That night marks the end of your life as a boy and the beginning of your life as possession. Every gift he offers will come with hidden chains. Every kindness will carry poison. When you walk with him into the papal palace, dressed in silk robes instead of rags, you will believe you have escaped the streets. But you have only traded one form of death for another. Rome in 1550 was no city of saints. It was a hunting ground. Orphans like you were the currency of lust. Holy men in red and gold robes prowled its alleys, disguising predation as charity. They called themselves shepherds. But what shepherd feeds on his own flock? When you bit into that bread you thought you were rescued. But rescue was never the goal. You were being recruited, prepared for transformation, for ritual, for corruption sanctified in the name of God. And the world would soon celebrate the man who trapped you as the holiest figure alive. When you entered the walls of the papal palace, you thought you were leaving behind the filth of the streets. And in some ways you were. No longer did you curl against stone walls for warmth, no longer did you scavenge rotten food from the gutters. Now you slept on cushions stuffed with feathers, beneath ceilings painted with angels and saints. Servants bathed you, clothed you in silks, and placed golden goblets in your trembling hands. Yet every luxury was another shackle, tightening around your body, binding you to the man who had plucked you from the dirt. To the world outside, Cardinal Giovanni del Monte was a patron of the arts, a man of refinement, destined for greatness within the church. To you he was a captor whose hunger never ceased. He didn't merely want your body, he wanted your obedience, your innocence, your very identity. You were to become his creation, molded by his desires, hidden beneath the veil of holiness. At first it was confusing. He spoke to you with affection, calling you his boy, praising your beauty, lavishing gifts upon you that a child could scarcely comprehend. But every touch lingered too long. Every word of kindness was dipped in venom. And when the night came, you understood the true meaning of his generosity. The same man who had lifted you from the gutter now used you in ways no child should endure, cloaking his sins in ritual and secrecy. This was no isolated crime. Rome itself was diseased. Behind the gilded doors of the Vatican, beneath frescoes of Christ and angels, men sworn to celibacy indulged in the same appetites, protected by wealth and secrecy. They feasted on the powerless, convincing themselves that their robes made their crimes untouchable. And in many ways they were right. You, the boy once invisible to the world, now became an object of whispers. Courtiers smirked behind closed doors, diplomats exchanged rumors, and yet no one dared intervene. Because everyone knew the same truth: to expose him was to tear open the entire church. And no one would dare risk that. Thus you became his secret, his possession, his shadow. And soon, when he rose to the highest throne on earth, the papacy itself, your fate would intertwine with the destiny of Christendom. You were no longer a boy. You were the Pope's creature, trapped in silks, drowning in shame, and paraded before a world that pretended not to see. When Giovanni del Monte ascended to the papacy in 1550, taking the name Pope Julius III, the world celebrated his coronation with fanfare and solemn hymns. Bells rang across Rome, incense rose into the heavens, and crowds gathered to see the new vicar of Christ. To the faithful, he was the chosen successor of St. Peter, a man entrusted to guide millions of souls. But to you he was the same predator who had dragged you from the gutter, and now he ruled not only your life but the spiritual fate of Europe. You might have thought his elevation would hide you further, bury you in secrecy. Instead, the opposite happened. Julius did not conceal his appetite. He flaunted it. Before the ink on his papal seals was dry, he installed you, an orphan boy of 14, as his cubicularius, his personal chamber attendant. It was a position of power, one normally reserved for trusted clergy, yet he placed it in the trembling hands of a child. But it did not end there. He went further, bestowing lands, wealth, and even a noble title upon you, titles men twice your age would have killed for. The whispers spread like wildfire. Who is this boy? Why does the Holy Father treat him as more than a servant? Diplomats from France, Spain, and Venice all returned home with the same disturbing reports, that the Pope had taken a street child as his companion, elevating him in ways that mocked both custom and morality. The boy who once begged for bread now dined from golden plates at the Pope's side. You sat in councils meant for cardinals, your presence a scandal carved into the heart of Christendom. Foreign ambassadors wrote of their disgust, yet none dared challenge him openly. He was, after all, the supreme authority of the Catholic Church. To question him was to question God himself. And so the corruption spread like a disease. Julius surrounded himself with excess, lavish feasts, banquets that lasted for days, orgies whispered about behind locked doors. But at the center of it all, there you were, the boy plucked from filth, now paraded like a trophy, a living reminder that even the throne of Peter could be twisted into a theater of sin. The people prayed for holiness. Instead, they were given a pope who made his lust visible to the world. And you, once invisible, became the symbol of his corruption. The Roman court began to murmur. At first in whispers, then in bold laughter. Cardinals who had clawed for decades to reach the Pope's side watched with bitterness as a child sat where they should have been. The Vatican halls echoed not with reverence but with gossip. You, once a nameless orphan, had become a lightning rod of scandal. They called you innocenzo, a cruel irony, for there was nothing innocent about what you endured. Foreign envoys described you in their letters. A boy of striking looks, draped in silks, dining with the Pope as though you were his equal. Some claimed Julius could not bear to be apart from you, that he carried you everywhere like a prized possession. In an era when appearances were everything, when even rumors of impurity could destroy reputations, Julius made no effort to disguise his obsession. He did not care. Perhaps he believed his holy office made him untouchable. Perhaps he simply delighted in mocking the world. But Rome was watching. Rome always watches. And in the alleys, in the taverns, in the palaces of noble families, the truth spread. The Pope had taken a boy as his lover. Not just hidden away, but elevated him above men of power, drenching him in wealth stolen from the faithful. For every coin a poor pilgrim dropped into the offering box, you received another jewel, another estate, another title. The people expected a shepherd. Instead, they saw a wolf fattening his prey in public view. Protestants beyond the Alps seized upon the scandal like vultures, using it to fuel their attacks on Rome. Martin Luther's words against papal corruption suddenly had flesh and blood evidence. And still Julius did not relent. He clung to you with ferocity, as though losing you would unravel him completely. You meanwhile were trapped in a gilded cage. To the world you appeared privileged, untouchable, adored. But beneath the silks, you were still the boy who had once slept on stones. You could not leave. You could not refuse. For every gift came at a price, your silence, your obedience, your soul. And thus the Vatican, which should have been the heart of holiness, became a palace of whispers. Every marble corridor, every frescoed chapel, concealed the same unspoken question. How could the man chosen as Christ's representative indulge in such open depravity? The answer was simple. Because no one dared stop him. As the months turned into years, your role in the Vatican deepened, and with it, the corruption spread like rot through ancient wood. Pope Julius no longer treated you as a servant or even as a favorite. He treated you as if the Church itself bent around your will. Positions of power were granted at your request. Estates were signed over in your name, and cardinals learned quickly that pleasing you was the surest path to pleasing the Pope. They called you, the boy with the keys, for you could open doors that seasoned statesmen could not. Nobles bowed to you. Priests sought your favor. What should have been the holiest court in Christendom had become a theater of humiliation, where aged men in robes knelt before a child, knowing that to offend you was to risk exile, disgrace, or worse. And you, though still so young, learned the language of power. At first, you recoiled, bewildered by the sudden authority thrust upon you. But power corrupts even the innocent, and you had long ceased to be innocent. Soon you found yourself enjoying the whispers, the gifts, the trembling respect of men twice your age. The same hunger that once belonged only to Julius began to infect you as well. The Vatican treasury, swollen from indulgences and offerings, flowed into your hands. Villas, titles, banquets, and servants were heaped upon you, while outside the palace walls Rome starved. Pilgrims dragged their broken bodies across cobblestones to kiss the Pope's feet, never knowing that their coins bought you another ring, another cloak, another feast. It was a grotesque inversion of faith. The church that claimed to defend the weak was fattening the strong. The very seat of St. Peter was no longer a throne of sacrifice, but a stage for debauchery. And still Julius shielded you, defending you against all scandal, all criticism. Even when cardinals grumbled in secret councils, even when entire kingdoms mocked him, he did not yield. For him you were not merely a boy. You were a mirror of his own corruption, a reflection of the weakness he could not hide. To cast you aside would have meant admitting his sin. So instead he tightened his grip, and in doing so, dragged the entire church deeper into disgrace. The line between holy and profane blurred until it vanished. And at the center of that darkness, was U.by the second year of Julius's reign. The Vatican was no longer governed by tradition or scripture, it was governed by you. The boy who had once slept in gutters now held the ear of the Pope, and through him, the destiny of Christendom itself. Every decision passed through your shadow. Cardinals, men hardened by decades of study and service, bent their knees not to Julius, but to the boy who whispered into his ear. Their robes brushed the marble floors as they bowed, their lips dry as they begged for favors that only you could grant. A bishop in Florence once said it plainly, to please Rome one must please the boy. And please you they did. Lands were offered, bribes slid across tables, promises whispered like prayers. You had become the new altar of power, and men who called themselves holy worshipped you as though you were divine. You knew the truth, they did not fear your wisdom nor your youth. They feared the Pope's hunger, and through that hunger they feared you. At first it overwhelmed you. To be raised from filth to palaces, to see the same men who once spat on beggars now offering their rings for you to kiss. But corruption is not a sudden storm. It seeps, it whispers, it tempts. And you, still only a child, began to taste its sweetness. The clothes of silk no longer felt strange. The golden cups no longer felt heavy. Soon, the boy who once begged for scraps was demanding banquets that spilled with wine and flesh, while the poor outside starved beneath the Vatican's walls. Letters from across Europe carried the same venom. The Pope has made a whore of the Church. Protestants laughed openly, their pamphlets filled with mocking images of Julius and his boy. Kings who once trembled before the papacy now sneered at its disgrace. Yet within Rome nothing changed. Julius did not falter. He silenced critics, rewarded flatterers, and raised you higher still. You were given estates, castles, titles reserved for noble blood. Men who could trace their lineage back 1,000 years now bowed before a child of the streets. And each time they bent, Rome bent with them. The Vatican was no longer the fortress of Christ. It had become a carnival of lust and greed. And at its center, dressed in velvet and gold, sat you, the boy who should never have mattered, but who now held the church in chains. But no power lasts unchallenged. For every jewel placed on your fingers, 100 knives were sharpened in secret. The Vatican, though draped in silence, was a nest of serpents, and you had become their common enemy. The cardinals despised you, though they kissed your hand in public. They saw in you not just a boy, but the embodiment of everything that threatened their authority. You were the wedge driven between them and the Pope, the reminder that decades of service meant nothing compared to the Pope's obsession with a child. In their chambers they whispered of poison, of daggers, of disgrace. But Julius's shadow was too large and his power too absolute. To strike at you was to strike at him, and none dared risk their souls so openly. Yet outside the Vatican walls, danger brewed. Rome's streets echoed with bitter songs mocking the Pope and his little husband. Pamphlets circulated in secret markets, scrawled with images too obscene to describe. They painted you as the corrupter of Christ's throne, the whore of Babylon made flesh. To the people you were not a victim. You were a usurper, the thief of their faith, the boy who drank their alms in golden chalices while their children starved. And still you could not leave. You were chained not by iron but by favor, by privilege, by Julius's unrelenting grasp. He guarded you with a lover's paranoia, surrounding you with guards, forbidding you from straying too far from his side. You were not free, you were property, a treasure he would rather see destroyed than lost. But treasures attract thieves. One night, as you wandered the gardens heavy with the scent of citrus and rot, a blade flashed from the darkness. You never saw the face, only the glint of steel, the rush of footsteps, the burning sting across your side before Julius's guards dragged the would-be assassin away. He was never seen again. Rome whispered that he was a cardinal's agent. Others said he was a Protestant zealot. But you knew the truth, it could have been anyone. Everyone hated you. From that night on, the Vatican no longer felt like a palace. Felt like a tomb. Every step echoed with menace, every prayer carried the weight of accusation. And though Julius still clung to you, the boy who once seemed untouchable now lived under a shadow darker than any gilded ceiling could conceal. The world was preparing to devour you. The first attempt on your life had left you scarred, but worse than the wound was the laughter that followed. Rome no longer whispered, it mocked. In taverns, actors performed crude plays, with children dressed as popes and whores, reenacting your hold over Julius. Coins were tossed to them as they shouted vulgar jokes about the Pope's boy. The very people who once bowed in awe at the Vatican now spat on its gates, daring its guards to silence them. Pamphlets spread faster than the guards could burn them. They showed you lounging in silks, a chalice in your hand, while Christ himself was whipped in the background. Others painted you as a serpent coiled around Julius's neck, strangling him as he smiled. And though these images enraged the Pope, they could not be erased. Once the world sees corruption, it cannot be unseen. Inside the Vatican, humiliation took another form. Cardinals who dared not strike at Julius found subtler ways to wound you. They froze when you entered chambers, refusing to bow. They murmured your name like a curse. Some, accidentally, left doors ajar during Julius's more private encounters with you, letting the whispers grow into scandalous certainty. Every corner of the palace seemed alive with eyes that judged, mocked, or condemned. And you, once drunk on power, began to wither under it. You could feel their hatred in the silence of banquets, in the cold stares across candlelit halls. When Julius paraded you beside him in public, the cheers of the faithful had turned to mutters, the mutters to boos. Once, in the middle of a procession, a stone was hurled from the crowd. It struck your shoulder, not hard enough to maim but enough to draw blood. Julius ordered the crowd beaten, but he could not erase the sound of their laughter ringing in your ears. The boy who had once been untouchable was now a target for ridicule. And yet, Julius would not release you. If anything, his obsession deepened with every attack. The more Rome mocked you, the tighter he clutched you, as if defiance itself could sanctify his sin. But it did not sanctify, it only magnified. Each act of humiliation dragged you further into a nightmare from which there was no waking. You were no longer just a scandal, you had become a symbol. And symbols cannot escape their fate. Why now, the Vatican's marble halls felt less like palaces and more like walls closing in. You were surrounded by wealth, but none of it belonged to you. The gold, the tapestries, the jeweled goblets, they were chains disguised as treasures. You could not step into the streets of Rome without risking death. You could not look a cardinal in the eye without seeing contempt. And yet, Julius's grip only tightened. He rarely let you leave his side. At night, he would summon you like a talisman, demanding your presence even when his council met. His obsession had grown grotesque. It was no longer desire, it was ownership. You were the mirror in which he saw his power reflected, and he would not allow the mirror to shatter. Guards followed you constantly, watching, listening, reporting. Even when you ate, when you slept, when you tried to pray, there were eyes on you. You began to realize you were not a guest of the Vatican. You were its prisoner. The cardinals knew it too. They watched as Julius paraded you in robes worth more than kingdoms, as he granted you estates and titles that mocked the ancient nobility. Each gift only deepened their fury but also their patience. For men of the cloth, they were cunning politicians. They had seen popes rise and fall. And they knew one thing with certainty: Julius's reign would not last forever. So they waited. They let you bask in luxuries, let you believe your position was secure. But in hushed meetings behind locked doors, they plotted. Let the boy grow fat on his master's scraps, one cardinal is rumored to have said. When the master dies, so too will the pet. Outside, Rome burned with resentment. The poor starved while rumors of your feast spread like wildfire. Mothers cursed your name as their children begged for bread. To them, you were not a victim, you were the tyrant in miniature, the symbol of everything corrupt in the church. Their hatred was not quiet anymore. It boiled in the streets, in sermons, in whispered prayers begging God to cleanse his house of you. And though you tried to ignore it, some part of you knew, they would get their wish. The Vatican was not a fortress strong enough to hold back the tide forever. The walls that once protected you now felt like they were closing in, preparing to crush you. The storm could no longer be contained. What had begun as whispers in dark corridors now echoed openly through Rome: the boy must fall. Priests muttered it in confessionals, nobles muttered it in dining halls, and peasants muttered it in the gutter as they spat at the Vatican's gates. No one even bothered to hide it anymore. The pamphlets grew bolder. Some no longer mocked but called for your death outright. They compared you to the Antichrist, to the whore of Revelation, a parasite draining Christ's church of its lifeblood. One notorious pamphlet, smuggled into the very heart of the Vatican, showed you hanging from a gallows while angels rejoiced. When Julius saw it, he trembled with rage, but even he could not stop the tide. The cardinals began to test their power. They refused to honor your titles, ignored the Pope's decrees when they involved you, and quietly encouraged the spread of scandal. Some even let their servants spit the name Ganymede when you passed, a poisonous reminder of your role as the Pope's boy slave. You could feel the knives in their stares. They didn't need to strike now, the world was sharpening the blade for them. Julius raged like a cornered beast. He doubled your guards, confined you even more tightly within the Vatican, and punished anyone who so much as whispered against you. But with each lash, each exile, each silenced critic, his desperation grew more obvious. He was no longer defending his church. He was defending you. And that truth poisoned him in the eyes of Rome. Your world shrank to a few gilded rooms. The tapestries seemed to watch you. The walls seemed to echo your name in mockery. You could hear the crowds outside the Vatican at night, chanting against Julius, against you. Their voices drifted through the stone like a prophecy. Down with the boy. Down with the Pope's whore. You began to understand that this was not just politics, not just gossip. It was hunger. The people wanted blood. And when mobs crave blood, they are never denied it for long. Somewhere deep in the Vatican, you heard it said plainly, "The boy will not outlive the Pope." It was no longer a rumor. It was a sentence that it began with isolation. One morning, the guards who had once shadowed your every step simply stopped speaking to you. Their eyes slid past you as though you were already dead. Servants who once bowed now pretended not to hear your commands. Even the lavish meals, once overflowing with wine and roasted meats, grew sparse, cold, unseasoned. The Vatican had decided. You were to be erased, not with fire or sword, but with silence. At first, Julius resisted. He clung to you like a drowning man, raving at his cardinals, threatening excommunication, imprisonment, even execution for anyone who dared insult you. But his body was failing him. Age and illness gnawed at his strength, and for the first time, his voice no longer shook Rome. The lion had begun to weaken, and the jackals could smell it. In hushed conclaves, the cardinals plotted your fate. They no longer needed pamphlets or rumors. They had the people. They had the power. And soon they would have the Pope's throne. All they had to do was wait until Julius's final breath. You, however, would not be granted that mercy. Whispers of your execution ran through the marble halls like smoke. Some wanted you strangled in your chambers. Others wanted you paraded through the streets before the mob. A few, more cunning, spoke of simply making you vanish, your body buried in silence, your name erased from every record. Even Julius seemed to sense it. His temper flared wildly. One night, in a fit of rage, he swore to make you a bishop, to place a mitre on your head so the world could never touch you. But even in his madness he knew it was impossible. The church would rather burn itself to the ground than crown its scandal. And so you waited, caged in gold, listening to the city that once feared you now bay for your blood. The echo of their chants seeped into your dreams. Sometimes you woke in the night convinced that the mob had already breached the gates. You would run to the window, trembling, only to see torches flickering in the distance. They were not yet inside, but they were coming. The Vatican had decided your fate long before you realized it. You were not simply a boy anymore. You were a curse that had to be purged. And soon they would. The old lion's breath grew shallow. Julius, who once roared and made kings tremble, now coughed blood into silk sheets. His body had betrayed him, and with it so had his authority. The Vatican, sensing the shift, became a vulture's feast. The cardinals gathered like carrion birds, circling the dying pope, whispering not prayers but bargains. Every man calculated who would rise next, and in those whispered deals, your name was already written in blood. You could feel it in the air, the way guards watched you with hollow eyes, the way servants avoided your chambers, the way even the marble floors seemed colder underfoot. The Vatican was not your prison anymore. It was your tomb. Julius clung to you with the desperation of a man who knew the end. In his fevered delirium, he would call for you at night, gripping your wrist with skeletal fingers, muttering half-coherent promises of protection, of immortality. But even as he spoke, you could see the terror in his eyes. He knew the truth. The moment he was gone, you were finished. Outside, Rome buzzed like a swarm of hornets. The rumors were no longer rumors. They were prophecies shouted in the streets. The boy will hang. The boy will burn. Every tavern had its own version of your death, every preacher his own sermon damning you to hell. Mothers dragged their children away from Vatican walls as though your shadow itself could taint them. You had become less than human. You were a disease in flesh, and the cure was execution. Even within the Vatican, the whispers grew bolder. A chamberlain smirked when you passed. A priest muttered sodomite under his breath as he offered you bread. You began to see yourself not as a victim, but as prey already marked, the kill inevitable. You could not sleep, for in the silence you imagined footsteps at your door, a rope hidden in the guard's hands, poison in your cup. And yet, despite the terror, a cruel truth gnawed at you. Some part of you wished it would come quickly. To live one more day under the weight of their hatred felt worse than death itself. The city was not waiting for Julius to die. It was waiting for you. The end came quietly. There was no thunderclap, no divine omen, only the rasping rattle of a dying man's lungs. One night, as Rome slept beneath its stars, Pope Julius II finally surrendered his breath. The lion was gone, and with him your only shield. The moment his eyes closed, the Vatican shifted. Servants who had once bowed to you did not even meet your gaze. Guards who had sworn to protect you vanished from their posts. By dawn, the whispers had already hardened into orders. The boy was no longer the Pope's companion. He was the Pope's shame. And shame must be destroyed. The cardinals convened with frightening speed, not to mourn Julius, but to cleanse his legacy. Their first act was not prayer but purging. They struck your name from documents, seized your chambers, and scattered your belongings like refuse. Within hours, you were reduced from untouchable to disposable. The city that once trembled before your shadow now sharpened its knives. Outside the Vatican, the bells tolled for the dead Pope. But the streets did not grieve. They celebrated. To them, Julius's death was the promise of justice, the promise that you would finally pay. The chants returned, louder than ever, echoing against the stones. Burn the boy. Burn the whore of the Vatican. Your world collapsed into panic. Every creak of wood, every whisper of sandals in the corridor, every flicker of torchlight felt like the beginning of your execution. You knew the conclave would choose a new pope soon. And whoever took that throne would have only one path to legitimacy: your blood. Some whispered you might be strangled before dawn. Others that you'd be thrown into a dungeon so deep no one would ever hear your screams. The cruelest said you'd be paraded naked through the streets of Rome, your body broken by stones before the mob dragged you to the pyre. And through it all, you realized something darker than fear. No one, not a single man, would stand for you. Not the servants, not the guards, not the cardinals. With Julius gone, you were alone in the world. For the first time since your rise, you understood the truth. You had never been powerful. You had only been a reflection of his power. And now that he was gone, you were nothing but a shadow waiting to be erased. The conclave met in secrecy, but their decision needed no parchment. Rome already knew. You were guilty not of a crime written in law, but of something far heavier, being the living stain of a pope who had dared to love you. And for that you would be erased. They came at night. The knock was not a question, it was a sentence. Guards you once recognized dragged you from your chambers, their eyes cold, their grip merciless. You pleaded, not for life but for understanding, yet no words could reach them. To them you were no longer human. You were filth to be washed away. The dungeon swallowed you. Damp stone, the stench of iron, the silence between screams from unseen cells. You were stripped of silks, stripped of name, stripped of identity. You were no longer Julius's companion, no longer the boy. You were only a condemned thing awaiting disposal. Outside, the city roared in anticipation. Word spread like wildfire: the Pope's whore was captured. Crowds gathered at every gate, chanting, begging for blood. Rome demanded a spectacle, and the Church, hungry to cleanse itself, was eager to give it. Your final dawn came with no mercy. They dragged you into the light, not as a man but as a warning. The crowd erupted in fury at the sight of you. Rotten fruit, stones, spittle rained down upon your body as the mob howled. Mothers held their children high so they could see the fall of the boy who had defiled Christ's throne. No trial. No defense. Only judgment. You were paraded through streets that once whispered your name with envy, now shrieking it with hatred. Every step was a funeral march, every jeer a nail in your coffin. At last, the procession halted before the stake, wood piled high, waiting to devour you in fire. The rope bit your wrists. The smoke clawed your throat before the flames even touched you. And as the pyre roared to life, your screams became one with the city's jubilation. The boy was gone. The stain erased. Rome rejoiced. And when the ashes scattered into the wind, nothing remained of you but silence. The silence history always grants to those it chooses to forget. But still, if you listen closely, you can hear the echo of the truth. A boy devoured by a world that could never admit what it had done. History does not erase sins. It buries them. And only those who dare to dig them back up see the world as it truly is. If you want more of the stories the church, the emperors, and the kings tried to hide, stay with History in Silence. Subscribe. Because the next secret is darker than this one.